All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Squire. I'm in the Community Engagement Division in the Planning Department. This is our May DIY meeting. It's National Preservation Month, so we can all get excited about that. I'm particularly excited about this because I live in a historic neighborhood, and so I'm excited to talk for our topic today. We're going to have three presenters today. And feel free to ask questions along the way. And we are recording this. So if you want to forward this, I'll send out a link to the recording after our meeting. And then any materials or anything that the presenters want to share, feel free to send those to me after the meeting. And then I'll include the link to this recording as well as any materials that you want to share with the broader group. And I'll send those out. With that said, we'll start off with Monica Snow from Preservation Dayton, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so I have to figure, I think I just have to click on share screen, right, Mike? You've given me, okay.
Yeah, you should be good.
Great. Can everybody see this?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll try to zip through this since there's three presenters. I'm presenting on behalf of Preservation Dayton, which was founded as a nonprofit organization in 1983. There were three leaders from the Oregon District, South Park, and St. Anne's that decided that together we're stronger. So these first slides are just some of the successes. I won't go into a lot of detail on each one, but these buildings or parts of these complexes are standing today. A little known fact, Christmas in April was an initiative that early Preservation Dayton leaders started, which now evolved into Rebuilding Together. You might have just read about the great work on the National Rebuilding Day. Those are some of our successes. These are some of our sad losses. Julianne, Roosevelt High School. And then on our website, we keep track of the properties that we have lost year by year, and we're hoping that we lose no more. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So I'm going to talk about four key reasons why many of us are passionate about historic preservation. Preservation tells our stories, it helps our environment, it creates caring communities, and it helps our economy. So I'm going to start with a quiz. You can put this in chat or just chime out. The first question, true or false? Paul Laurence Dunbar was born near the Oregon District. True or false? The answers will come up in a minute. The first Hungarian Kossuth community was built in Old North Dayton, and it provided workers from Hungary for the Barney Car Works. And then the last question is true or false? Temple Israel purchased its first building at 4th and Jefferson, which you can see here to the left, in 1863. And the Masons and the Oddfellows contributed to the building renovation fund for the temple. Here are the answers. True, Paul Laurence Dunbar was born on Howard Street. False, the first Hungarian Kossuth community was actually out on West 3rd and Broadway for the large manufacturing plant, which is no longer there, Dayton Malleable. And true, Temple Israel did get funding for its very first property that it owned at 4th and Jefferson. They later built this temple at 1st and Jefferson and then relocated to Dayton View after the flood. So the key point here is it's much harder to learn about our past histories and our stories once our physical built environment is gone. And one of the ways Preservation Dayton is trying to make sure that we continue to tell our stories is by creating these walking tours that we did with help from the city through a $5,000 mini grant 2 years ago. We took the print brochures that previous Preservation Dayton leaders created. We updated all the content, and you can go online and do our historic walking tours of all our officially designated residential areas in two ways. One through an audio voice tour on your phone, or we have photos and print PDFs, and you can download those and use those on your phone as well. So thank you, City of Dayton. Another way that we try to tell our stories and share our successes is through our Excellence in Preservation Awards. These are just some examples of some of the success stories. We will be honoring all of these award recipients and more on June 12th. It's a members only event, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But here's some examples. Reza's Roast on Wayne Avenue was a pit. The story about the Mackeys literally taking 2 or 3 years to dig out from under all the debris. Many of you know Galen and Mitzi Wilson, and Mike and Diana Regner in South Park. Those 2 houses in the middle were nursing homes joined together into one facility. There are now 2 vibrant historic homes on Park Avenue. And then many of you know Shannon Jackson of Her Realtors, who did a stellar job with her historic building in Wright Dunbar Inc. So those are just some of those examples. Another key way that preservation helps is by sustaining our environment. If you haven't woken up to the fact, our planet's in deep doo-doo. So the National Trust for Historic Preservation did a groundbreaking study several years ago. There's the link, you can look it up. But the key point is we use far less energy by retaining the buildings that we have versus investing the energy and filling a landfill with demolished buildings. There's been an estimate that on an annual basis in the United States, we demolish 1 billion square feet of property and we replace it with new construction. So you can imagine how much energy that uses. This is an eye chart, but this is exactly what the Green Lab and the National Trust for Historic Preservation did, analyzing how much energy it takes to either renovate or build these 4 classes of properties. So if you're an environmental preservationist nerd like me, I love this chart. These are 2 great examples here in Dayton. You may not know this, but the Armory, which just came before the Landmarks Commission here in our neighborhood in the Oregon District, and the Cannery are actually powered by geothermal energy. So not only are we saving the built environment, we're also using a key asset of energy that we have here in Dayton. You may have heard about one of our recent successes. We were able to convince UD Premier and Woodard Development to save the historic South Park Methodist Church down by UD and Warren. And one of the key arguments we made with Dr. Spina and the decision makers is that UD does have a goal of being carbon neutral, I believe, by 2030, 2040. So again, saving that built environment and all the energy we've invested, not only the beautiful architecture, but the cultural heritage of the church was one of our key arguments. I know everybody at DIY loves our neighborhoods. I know that we all are building caring communities, but we sort of are a little bit chauvinistic in historic districts. The proximity of our houses together, the revitalization of young families moving into the city helps to create a caring community. And these are just some examples. You'll see Mike Squire right there with his family and Huffman. And obviously, Shannon Jackson tells us that there's a waiting list for people to buy homes in Wright Dunbar Inc. One of the key things about historic neighborhoods in our city, and I should have added at the beginning, when you compare Dayton, if you visit Columbus and the Central Business District, if you go to Indianapolis, even if you go down to Cincinnati, they've managed to save over the Rhine, but Dayton has a really strong inner ring of our historic districts, as I mentioned on that walking tour. And one of the unique things about our historic districts is that many of our neighborhoods were built for both leading citizens and wealthy people in Dayton at the time, as well as working class people. And we hear about the great sifting of residential areas by income, by race. The historic districts create that foundation and that structure. So you get on my street, you get a big mansion like the Balsley Mansion, the inventor of the modern stepladder, and then our little modest shotgun house that was built for a Dayton constable at the time. So again, the proximity of our homes, our unique architecture, our walkability, and access to diverse businesses and residents of all backgrounds and income levels and ethnicities. Preservation also spurs the economy. Many of you have been at several conferences and gone to the exhibit on Undesign the Red Line. Bill Marvin can chime in here. If you kind of look at where redlining happened historically I'm sorry, I jumped ahead, I apologize. Preservation spurs the economy. I jumped to redlining and I shouldn't have. When Commissioner Whaley was a commissioner, she put together a preservation task force. You can read this whole study on our preservation website. But basically, University of Dayton did an analysis from 1996 to 2014. The property values in historic districts compared to non-historic districts increased exponentially because, again, of that focus on the quality of housing and the architecture. One of the concerns about historic zoning and gentrification is displacement of existing families. And that does not have to happen. We have a great success story here in Wright Dunbar Village. Thanks to people like Bootsy Neal, Paul Whitty at the time, other community leaders like Mary Ellington, who still is in her family home for over almost 90 years. We put together a program, the City of Dayton and the City Commission, to have a tax abatement program that helped the current property owners. So as the property values increased in that neighborhood, they were not displaced because they couldn't afford their property taxes. Karen DeMassey, who works for Citywide, actually published a nationally used textbook that talks about that case study. And Mike, this might be a topic for, we still have the Dayton Community Reinvestment Area Tax Abatement Program. So that may be a topic for a future Dayton is Yours program. And this is a nationwide movement that is taking hold everywhere to make sure that we support the existing families who own their homes in current neighborhoods. This is just a quick overview. You've all read about the big effort of historic tax credits. It's really what's fueling all the big projects like the arcade downtown. You can read this whole analysis, but basically the headline is that for every dollar of tax credits since 1976, we've generated $1.20 in actual profits and in reinvestment in the community, and leveraged $5 in private investment. This study also shows that when you actually rehab a building, you're creating more local rehabilitation, more local construction jobs than you are with new construction. Ohio is lucky. We have a very robust historic tax credit program as well. Again, you see the same return on investment. For every dollar in tax credits leveraged, we got about a $7 return. This was a study done by University of Toledo for the Ohio State Preservation Office. One of the key things I want to point out here is we all know about the big projects downtown, but there are 3 categories of historic tax credits. It has to be an income producing property. So the big catalytic projects like the arcade, like the Delco Law, the Sandy Mendelson project that's being redone are highly competitive, but up to $250,000, many of those tax credit assets go unrewarded, either because people don't know about it or they don't know how to apply for them. So we do have an example here in Mike's district. The McNamara's actually used historic tax credits to redevelop a duplex that their grown children and grandchildren are living in. So here's just some of the examples. I'm sure you've read about all of them in the paper coming online. The Delco Lofts. Obviously, everyone in Dayton View and Grafton are very excited about Longfellow School getting rehabilitated. And then you've seen the great work that's happening in Fire Blocks. But there's more to be done. We're all here because we're focused on concerns about housing in our neighborhood. This is not a happy place for Dayton to be, but on a per unit basis, we lead all the other major cities in Ohio with the largest number of vacant housing units. So how does Preservation Dayton help? We continue to do what we've done since 1983. Sometimes we wax, sometimes we wane. I feel like thanks to great trustees like Fred and Bill Marvin, Keegan Sickles, many others, we're back on the road again to educate, advocate, and collaborate. So this is where I jumped ahead to the redlining. If you kind of look at where our historic districts are, many of them were subjected to years of disinvestment, and still to this day, some discriminatory lending practices. So that's the famous red line map. Bill Marvin and Dan Barton are working on actually extending the boundaries of the Grafton National Register District, because again, what historic preservation can do is help to attract private investment, but also help current homeowners. So our organization offers expertise in National Register listings, historic tax credits for smaller income producing properties that I just mentioned. And we have a member and former board member who is an expert in 203K loans, where you can combine your your home ownership and your renovation project together. Bill, and as I just said a minute ago, Bill and Dan Barton are working on extending the National Register boundaries of the Grafton area. And then thanks to Gloria White, Gloria pulled together several neighborhood organizations, and Preservation Dayton is volunteering our time and effort to actually get the core business area of the Santa Clara Business District on the National Register. This is just a glance at what redlining has done just in a very small area of Five Oaks. If you saw the overall exhibit, or you went to the two-day conference on reimagining community at that University of Dayton and Sinclair sponsored, you get a sense of what redlining means at a really high level. But this full presentation to the Landmarks Commission is on our Preservation Dayton website, and it shows just how single blocks in the Five Oaks area were greatly impacted because it got a negative grade because perhaps a Greek family or an Italian family or an African-American family lived in that area, and they were downgraded. We also try to educate. If you haven't seen a couple of Quinn's YouTube series, they have done great work taking you inside two major renovations that are going on in Fred's neighborhood, the Governor Cox Mansion that Chris Lewis is working on, and the Mini over in St. Anne's Hill. Dayton Architecture Instagram, Alex Duncan is another one of our members. She holds meetups, and if you're not on her Instagram site and you love beauty and architecture, I suggest you do. June 12th is our Excellence in Preservation Awards event for members and award recipients. So join Preservation Dayton if you want an invitation. There'll be free food and beverages. We also are planning a tour of the Mini and also a bourbon and bricks tasting and pre-Snoop tour of what's happening with the Journal Herald building and the Price Brothers. If you become a member, we have an exclusive contractor directory, and we also have information on financing your renovation. We are looking at also perhaps starting a Cleveland Restoration Society has a heritage home program that they've been running in Cleveland. We've had several meetings with them about possibly offering a very similar kind of program in Dayton, just one of our many to-dos. We also advocate for investing in our neighborhoods. We all share the concern about what blight really does. I really honestly urge you to look at this New York Times opinion piece. The University of Pennsylvania Urban Health Lab and their Department of Emergency Medicine have done controlled trials of what it really means to a community, the physical and the mental health and the safety of a community, simply by cleaning up vacant lots and vacant properties. And those controlled trials show that for every dollar that they spent in Philadelphia, they saved $333 in medical costs, policing, and incarceration costs. So again, it's a very fascinating academic study that's been going on for over 10 years in the Philadelphia area. So investment in our neighborhoods saves on all fronts, not only revitalizing our communities. Thanks to Fred, after losing the St. Joseph School over by St. Joseph Church, the historic school there, Fred said enough. And so Fred conceived the idea of forming a top 10 most endangered historic properties initiative for Preservation Dayton. So a year ago, last March, we asked the community to nominate what they felt were the most endangered properties. We got about 100 or so nominations overall. Committee that Fred headed scored about 38. And we came up with the top 10. If you haven't seen them, you can look at them on our website. With no real concerted fundraising effort other than the social media and traditional media we got for announcing the top 10, we've managed to raise about $17,000. We have a charitable giving account with the Dayton Foundation. We're looking, in fact, Fred and I are meeting today at noon with our committee. We're looking at other ways that we can do more concerted fundraising, again, through something like a Heritage Home program in Cleveland or a revolving fund. These are the key things that we are, sorry, Jerry just walked in. These are the key things that we're working on. We don't have time to go in them today, but they're all issues that we all share. One is we have been advocating for the last year or so for a new and improved lot links program between Montgomery County Land Bank and the city of Dayton. We're happy to share what we think are the strengths of both those programs, bringing them together. Right now, we have no operation of the Montgomery County Land Bank in the city of Dayton. Thanks to Stan Hurdle, who's on the call, we've done extensive research on the most effective vacant property programs and ordinances in other Ohio cities. Stan is actually working on drafting that language. Sneak preview, the three that we think are most effective are Columbus, Youngstown, and believe it or not, Gallipolis. So we're making phone calls to those cities just to see what results those ordinances have gotten. So far, 2 volunteers have called Gallipolis and Columbus, and I'm supposed to be calling Akron, and I haven't done my homework, but they've actually put vacant properties back into use with home ownership. We've explored the receivership action, which many other cities and counties use for addressing derelict properties, and Able Law has committed to helping Preservation Dayton when and if we find the right property to put into receivership, assuming we have the funds to address the code enforcement. We have had productive meetings with John McManus, the county treasurer, about 6 of our top 10 endangered properties that have back taxes. And then obviously, as Holly will attest, and many city officials, we show up regularly at Landmarks Commission, BZA, and Plan Board hearings. And then I mentioned our communication with Cleveland. We're also in touch with Cincinnati Preservation Association and Columbus Landmarks as well, to become the preservation powerhouses that they are. So there's our top 10. Please join. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them later on.
Thank you, Monica. That was great. Really appreciate your efforts and taking time this morning to share with us. Next up, we have Dr. Samiran Chanchani, who is with History Works. And so you can take over now. If you want to share something, Monica, if you want to stop sharing and then switch over.
I will try to do that. Stop share. I got it. Yay.
Okay. Yeah. Can everyone see my screen and hear me? Cool. My name is Samiran Chanchani, and I'm an architectural historian. I actually prepare National Register of Historic Places nominations. And I've worked as a consultant with the city of Dayton for a long, long time. I cannot even pinpoint the date when I started working. So it's always been my pleasure to work with the city and in the city itself. And um, my presentation is going to be on actually preparing National Register of Historic Places nominations. And I do realize that the context is with residential neighborhoods. Many of my examples might not specifically be about neighborhoods, but every aspect that I'm talking about applies to neighborhoods as well. And amongst the most recent nominations that are, I'm hoping that would be listed by May or June. It's going to go up to the National Park Service soon. Is the Dayton View Triangle Historic District, and that includes more than 1,000 buildings that are contributing to the district. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the neighborhood. And also the Boyer Mortuary Building. And then there are a couple of others in the pipeline in Dayton residential districts that are coming up also. So without further ado, I just wanted to start off with my presentation. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, the best way is via my email, that's historyw@historyworks.us. So what I'll be talking about today is I'll be considering the types of resources, historic resources that can be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is the National Register of Historic Places is maintained in Washington, D.C., and it identifies historic properties throughout the United States. These properties need not be eligible at a national level. As we have seen for Dayton properties, most of them are eligible at a local level for the city of Dayton. So they are historically important, not necessarily for throughout the state of Ohio or the United States. Historic property can be historically significant just for the city of Dayton itself. And that is, most of the resources are locally significant. We are going to talk about the different criteria to evaluate the historic significance of a property. Uh, Importantly enough, we are going to ask that the question that National Register nomination forms require us to ask, which is whether the property retains its historic character or its integrity. And I'll talk briefly about how the boundary of a historic property is decided. And then lastly, what is the process in Ohio for listing a property on the National Register of Historic Places? So as I said, that while I may not use a lot of examples that deal with specific residential neighborhoods, everything that I'm talking about applies to neighborhoods also. So what are the different historic property types or historic resources that can be nominated for to the National Register? Well, the most obvious one is buildings, such as the Vista and Getz building over here in Dayton, which also was later, I did the National Register nomination for that. It's on 210 Wayne Avenue. And then later on, it was also a tax credit project. So that's what Monica was talking about, the benefits of having historic properties is to be able to obtain those tax credits so that they can be rehabbed. That's about up to 45% of the cost covered by federal and state governments. Structures such as bridges could be eligible for the National Register. Sites such as parks, battlefields are eligible for the National Register. Objects. In this case, this is a state marker between Kentucky and Tennessee, and it actually decided what the boundary was after much conflict between the two states. So that is a National Register eligible property. It might look like a really humble piece of stone over here, but it was important. And objects can also include sculptures like this one, which people in Dayton are familiar with, which is a contributing structure to the downtown Dayton Historic District. And of course, districts which include all different types of properties. They may include bridges, buildings, objects, and sites. So here's the downtown Dayton Historic District. So districts, as I said, can include buildings, structures, sites, and objects. For instance, the downtown Dayton Historic District includes the McKinley statue in Cooper Park, which is an object, but it also includes Cooper Park itself, which is a site. So that's a contributing site and a contributing object. In the same way, there might be a park in a residential district that was developed in conjunction with the district, and so that would be included. So there are instances of that, for instance, in Dayton View Triangle, where the Otterbein property, the actual site of that is a contributing site to the district. So there, I was ahead of myself, but there you are. So this is the Dayton View Triangle Historic District boundary. And there are two resource types that we consider within the district. There are contributing resources, which are historic, which in this instance, I don't know how clear it is, but most of the buildings, 1,192 of them are contributing, and they are marked out in gray. And these include not only the buildings, but the garages that were constructed in association with the buildings. So the most humble properties can be historic. And then there are non-contributing resources. Many of them might have been constructed after the period of significance for the district, when the district was significant. So, if the property was constructed in 2005, for instance, it's after the period of significance. It's significantly less than 50 years old. It's after 1976, when the period of significance for Dayton View Triangle ends. So that property would not be historic. The other type of non-contributing resource is one that has lost its historic integrity. So that has been altered so much that its historic character is no longer visible, and in which case it would be non-contributing. So the National Register criteria, under what criteria are properties eligible to be listed in the National Register? There are four main criteria. The first one is if the property is associated with significant events. For instance, the downtown Dayton Historic District is associated with community development and planning through its period of significance. So it is important under criterion A. Criterion B is association with significant people. So if a significant person, let's just say Ernest Hemingway, has actually produced some of his most important books at a particular home, then that home would become significant because that person has actually done important work over there. Typically, if Ernest Hemingway was born in his birthplace, might not be significant unless he's lived a significant portion of his life and it's associated with his important achievements. The third type is distinctive characteristics of type, period, or construction, and this would be typically the architecture of the building. So, for instance, the Dayton View Triangle Historic District is associated with significant events. It's like the downtown district. It was associated with community planning and development, in this case for a residential neighborhood. But it's also associated with another aspect in significant events, and that is civil rights and racial integration in housing. So basically, Dayton View Triangle story is one of highly desired segregated neighborhood becoming integrated by the mid-70s. And that itself, it ties in with the redlining aspects that Monica had talked about. And that is an important aspect of the development and indeed the present condition of the situation in the district. And Dayton View Triangle is also important for its architecture. So a particular district or a particular individual resource can be significant under multiple criteria. And then the last is information potential. This typically applies to archaeological resources which are underground. In some instances, we know that there is a mound, but we do not want to disturb it. So, there is an information potential lying over there, and it would be significant for that. So typically the first three criteria are what would apply for us, for architectural historians, and for residential neighborhoods. They would apply in the most likely way. The fourth one would in all likelihood not apply for, not be as important for us. Now, apart from those criteria, there are some special criteria considerations where certain properties would not be eligible with certain exceptions. For instance, a religious property would not typically be eligible because of emotional ties that it might have to the people who are worshipping over there, except when the significance is primarily architectural, artistic, or historic. If a property is removed from its original location, it would not be typically be significant because it's not within its original context anymore, except when it's really architecturally significant or a surviving structure associated, the last surviving structure associated with a historic person or event. The birthplace or graveyard of a historic figure unless there is no other site associated with his or her productive life. A cemetery unless it's associated with important events, persons, or of distinctive style. Reconstructed buildings unless no structure of the same association has survived. And a commemorative property unless it has its own particular significance. So just to give some examples of each of these, or rather some of these. This is the Trinity Church in Copley Square in Boston. It would typically not be listed in the National Register, but as it so happens, it's a national landmark because of its architecture. And also it's also one of the most significant works of a really important late 19th century architect, H.H. Richardson. So it is significant for its architecture and not because of its association with religion. This one is more familiar to people in Dayton. This is for removal from an original location. The Hanich Huffman House on Monument Avenue is not at its original location, and it was listed after it was removed from its original location because of its significance, because of the significance of its architecture, and also I think association with important families from the 19th century. So we do have examples like this in Dayton itself. The Woodland Cemetery, once again, it's listed on the National Register, and here the special criteria considerations come into play because of its, its history and also because of its design and construction and architecture that it's associated with. Another criteria consideration is buildings or properties that are less than 50 years old. And having worked on some properties, not this particular one, but having worked on some Cold War properties, I know that many of the Cold War properties were listed well before they were 50 years old because of the association with that important event, which lasted from roughly 1947 to 1989. So for instance, this is the Titan Missile Museum in Arizona, and it's a great place to visit. I've been there, and it was active from 1963 to 1982, and it was listed in 1992. And if anyone has seen the Star Trek, I forget the name of the movie, in which the First Contact, Star Trek First Contact, in which they learn how to use warp speed. The actual site for the missile, the rocket site that was used, was the Titan missile factory. So what Captain Picard is touching over here is this Titan missile itself. An important aspect of National Register nominations is integrity. So does the building retain its, in its physical characteristics, does it retain its association with the past? Now, there are different aspects of integrity. A property does not have to retain all of them, but it has to retain some of these aspects. The location of the property is really important. So unless if it has been moved, except in exceptional cases, it's probably not going to be eligible for listing on the National Register. Its setting is really important. So that is the actual physical context. So in this case, this is a National Register nomination I did for a warehouse building in the city of Piqua. And it has retained its overall context. Its in the commercial district, there are other commercial buildings around from that period that, let's say that it has retained its context. For instance, if this, apart from this building, the rest of it had turned into a suburban residential neighborhood, that would have an impact on the overall understanding of that building and its context. So that would affect its integrity. The design, in this case, the building has retained its design characteristics. If, for instance, it had been completely clad by new materials uh, 10 years ago, it probably would not retain its integrity of design. So you would not be able to see its actual architectural characteristics. Same goes with materials and workmanship. That also kind of ties in with the design and physical structural characteristics of the building. And then there are two more aspects, which are feeling and association. So these are much more abstract, but basically, the feeling part is, if you see the property and its overall context, is that historic feeling still tangible in that property? So that's one aspect. And association is also abstract, but probably less so. For instance, if its association with its original uses can be found, both in the exterior of the building as well as the interior of the building, then it retains that aspect of integrity. So property meeting National Register character, if it meets the National Register criteria, if it's significant under a particular criteria, A, B, or C, and it retains its integrity, then it is rightly eligible for the National Register. So those are the two really important aspects of it. And then the historic boundary determination, that's really important because apart from actually understanding the history of the property, to protect the property from any federal undertakings or projects that are undertaken by the city or state, if there are rules associated with that, one would have to know the boundary of the property. So for instance, you might have a small farm building within a large boundary. The entire farm might be eligible for the National Register, but unless you really know the boundary, if a roadway is going to be constructed, one would not be able to adequately plan that roadway or the street without affecting the property if you don't know the boundary. If it traverses the property, then that's a significant impact on the property. So all aspects of the property's history should be identified within the boundary. So when one looks at the statement of significance, why is the property important? Are all aspects of that statement of significance available within that boundary, and then you choose the boundary. So that's how, for instance, the Dayton View Triangle boundary was a difficult one because it was platted at different periods of time, but then eventually it became one singular neighborhood, identified as a neighborhood. So the boundary was identified as the entire neighborhood rather than excluding some individual plats that might have been developed later than the earliest ones, for instance. So those are important aspects. And that applies to residential neighborhoods. It applies to commercial districts like the downtown Hamilton Historic District here in Ohio, where certain buildings were left out of the boundary because they did not quite meet the criteria, and other buildings were included within the boundary because they very much met the criteria, and that's how the boundary was selected. So I did mention this, that if there are any undertakings, a federal undertaking, in fact, there are National Register, National Park Service guidelines, and National Historic Preservation Act guidelines that guide the federal government regarding any historic properties. So, if a roadway is going to be constructed, there's a survey done prior to that to identify if there are any historic properties over there and if they're going to be affected. So that's when things like historic boundaries become really, really important. You need to protect your property from such projects, or at least take that into consideration when planning projects. The last thing that I'll go through is the nomination process in Ohio. And the first step would be to get in touch with the State Historic Preservation Office and let them know that you're planning, you're thinking about nominating the project, and you can download a National Register questionnaire form, which basically asks you, why is this property important? Can you give us some historical information, some maps, current photographs of the building and historic photographs, so we can make a preliminary determination as to whether you should go away with the National Register process or not. So once the State Historic Preservation Office has responded and said, well, you can go ahead with this project, or alternatively, we have a few additional questions, can you address these? And then, depending on the response that we get, you can go ahead with a National Register nomination. That's when you actually start preparing the National Register nomination. And the National Register form includes a description of the resource. If it's a district, you have to identify all the different buildings or building types and describe either all of them or typical examples of them. Then identify the criteria under which you think the building or the district or the object is significant. And then there's a statement of significance, which is a detailed context statement as to why the history of the building or the resource and why the resource is historically significant. It's a kind of a justification for listing that criteria. Of course, it includes other aspects such as the bibliography, maps, current and historic photographs, and other information. And all of this, a draft is sent to the National Park Service for review. And sometimes there are multiple drafts. They come back with comments. So the review process is rather long. It takes typically up to a year to finish that full review process, preparation of the form and the review process. And then if it's a large district, which can be the case in case of residential neighborhoods when there are more than 50 owners, the State Historic Preservation Office organizes a public meeting. And everyone, all the stakeholders, all the owners are invited to the meeting. And if I'm preparing the form, I'm present over there. And the owners can ask any questions as to how this historic National Register nomination might affect the status of their property. Is it going to mean that they're giving up some of the rights to what they can do with the buildings if it's on the nomination process, or just general historic questions and comments that they might have. So it's a really great opportunity for the public to comment. If it's less than 50 people, then the State Historic Preservation Office actually sends out letters to every individual owner about the National Register nomination, and thereby allowing them to comment, to agree with the nomination or disagree. And they can get in touch with the State Historic Preservation Office on an individual basis. Step number 4, once the nomination has been approved by the reviewers at the State Historic Preservation Office, there's a board of 13 members that's appointed by the governor, and that board reviews the nomination form in another public meeting. So if I'm preparing the form, I'm typically there, and I would always invite the stakeholders, the property owners, and my clients to be there, for the meeting, because it's always good to have strong support at that time. So once it has the board meeting, they'll ask questions, and they will at that time either approve or table the nomination pending certain modifications, or in very, very rare instances say that this nomination does not quite meet the needs that we feel are necessary for the National Register, and therefore we are declining it. So that happens in very rare cases. Never happened to neither tabling or that has ever happened to me. And once that meeting is over, then the State Historic Preservation Office finally prepares the nomination to send to the National Park Service, where the National Park Service reviews the nomination, and there's a further period for the public to comment on it. So that's typically, I guess, about 45 days that they have. And once that period is over, it's actually listed on the National Register. So that is the entire long drawn process. It can take, for a district, it can take more than a year. For a modest individual property, it typically takes less than a year because of the amount of work that is needed and the review period and the fact that it is less complex, a nomination. So, and last, I think Monica has really gone through the benefits of having historic properties, but I'm just going to add to a little bit. The rehabbing tax credits, I think it was really covered very well. So up to 45% of the cost of your project can be covered if you're rehabilitating the building for commercial use. It's not the same if it's a residential building. You can protect the historic properties from projects that may affect them adversely. They can retain the historic character and value, especially if it's a case of historic districts, whether it's a residential district or a commercial district. Not the least, you have bragging rights, and you're never going to lose that as long as you have that district. And I'd say an important part of this is that a lot of people are really, they question the validity of having a national register nomination because they feel that once it's on the national register, the state or the federal government is not going to allow them to make changes to their buildings. But that's really not the case unless you're actually taking federal funding, such as in tax credits. You could make changes to the project without federal or state review. There might be local landmark laws that you have to abide by. So, that would be a different case. So in European countries, preservation is much more stringent as to what you can and cannot do. Here, the property owners in the United States have considerable rights, even if the property is listed on the National Register. So I typically calm property owners' fears regarding federal or state intervention if their property is listed on the National Register. And I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Stan.
Yeah, on the last topic, I know there was an effort in University Row to try and get historic preservation, and there was a lot of concern that if you had that, you couldn't do certain things, particularly facing the street, and that was a factor in that not happening. You're saying that there are no rules like that, or that the rules are only federal and state, but there may be local rules that that would interfere with somebody's ability to change the appearance of their front, for instance, or their front fence and things like that. Can you talk some
No,
more about
I
that?
think there are no the federal rules would not apply. Since I think the city people would be able to answer this better, but since Cincinnati is a certified local government with the State Historic Preservation Office, the city would be required to have, if it's a local landmark or a historic district, the city would be required to have a certain process for approving projects that might affect the historic integrity of individual properties or a district. So it is not a federal or a state regulation per se, but it would actually be the responsibility of the local government.
Can I add to that, Stan, for clarity? We have a local landmarks commission, and we have local guidelines that protect historic properties, and that's where most of the restrictions are. It's not at the National Register level, it's at our local landmarks commission level.
That's a great segue. One, I want to say, if you do, totally understand if you have to hop off at 11, that's no problem at all. But that is a great segue to Holly Hornbeak, who's our preservation officer here at the city, to talk a little bit more about the local regulations. And really, we wanted to have this conversation. I think it's relevant because a lot of our neighborhoods are coming up against that, the potential for this. And so it's important to have this information out there. So if you do have to take off at 11, no big deal. I'll be sending the link out so that you can check out if you do have to miss it. So go ahead and take over, Holly.
Yeah, assuming everyone can hear me. That is a good thing to point out. For instance, the city of Dayton, we have 20 historic districts, untold landmarks, but we have 20 districts. Only 12 of those are locally designated and sort of locally governed. So there are some districts that don't sort of have local guidelines, but they still have any state or federal funds that's when they need approval. So I actually have a little presentation too. Try to zip through it a little quicker than I might otherwise. So yeah, just some general information on historic districts and what sort of local governance looks like when you are a locally recognized historic district. So a historic district we've gone over, it's a collection of buildings, normally residential, sometimes there's commercial in there, or it will be an entire commercial district. They have that historic integrity. They've been nationally recognized. And so we have 3 different local levels of protection, HD 1, 2, and 3. HD 2 is the most sort of restrictive. HD 3 only prevents demolition without approval. So it's sort of the least restrictive. And then HD 1 is sort of in the middle. So HD 1, it governs only major modifications. So a lot of times you'll see these in sort of more commercial areas, a little looser rules to help with business owners and things like that. Or in the case of Grafton Hill, the entire district is an HD 1. And so that's only major modifications, new construction, new additions, alteration of door and window openings, fenestration, window patterns are really important to the style of the building. So altering something like that is still considered major. You have to go to the Landmarks Commission for approval. It doesn't govern minor modifications, which are more like routine things. You want to replace a door, you want to paint, replace gutters or trim. You can do all that without contacting me or getting a certificate of appropriateness. HD2, the most restrictive, it's what we have in most of our districts. It's any exterior work, you will need the approval of either the Landmark Commission or myself, or Abigail Free can also issue certificates of appropriateness. And a lot of times for things that are minor, it's fairly routine. You send me or Abigail an email, you give us a phone call, you give us sort of a description of the project, as long as it adheres to sort of, what we want to see. It's not going to be detrimental to the building. We can issue you a certificate same day. For major modifications, it still goes to the Landmark Commission. The same sort of rules apply there. HD3, you generally only see this on an individual structure, and it just safeguards against unwarranted demolition. It's something significant. A lot of times the property owner doesn't want any sort of heavier restrictions on what they can do with the property, but we can at least get protection from demolishing it unless you really can prove that that's the only sort of way forward with that building. So just to go over again, a bit of the major and minor modifications. Major, you're looking at construction or removal of a building, an addition, a porch, a deck, anything that is sort of a decorative detail. And a lot of times, you'll look at this as like removal of any of these details. What we really want you to do is retain and repair any sort of work that you have. It's the difference between having a building that is historic and having a building that looks historic. You want to retain as much of the original materials as you can. And so you'd also be looking at sort of removal of chimneys, doors or windows, modification of door and windows openings. A lot of times older buildings, at some point in their history, someone came in and cut it up into apartments, especially if it's a larger house. So you might have a bunch of extra doors. And so coming in and saying, can I infill some of these doors? That's something that generally will get approved, unless it was historically something like a duplex, in which case you need to maintain that separate opening. That's what it was built to be, even if it's no longer a duplex and it's now a single family. Minor modifications, fences, glass block in non-street facing basement windows, some accessory structures. If you want to build a garage on an alley, a lot of times staff can approve that. We just have some different specifications you have to adhere to. Replacing your windows, replacing a door with another appropriate door, paint, landscaping, sidewalk repair, roof replacement, a lot of repairs and replacements. As long as it's an appropriate replacement, you can get a same-day certificate. It's a minor modification. Some common errors we see. This presentation was originally for a historic district members, so I wanted to go through sort of things we see. We do allow vinyl replacement windows, but something a lot of people do is they'll get grids between the glass, and that's where we sort of have to draw the line. You need to have simulated divided lights. You need to have that exterior muntin. It keeps the window not looking as flat. It's still sort of obviously a replacement, but it's not as obvious. A lot of times we see inappropriate doors. You'll see doors with really small windows or circular glass, or sort of that mid-century door on the bottom. Those sort of aren't appropriate. Historic doors would have had large pieces of glass, if any. We do sort of allow raised panel doors. as an option, but what we really want to see is sort of that at least half glass style or 3/4 style door is what we really want to see on a historic home. Another one is paint. It would be sort of exhaustive to maintain sort of a list of approved colors, especially given how many paint companies there are and how many color name changes. But what you can always do is go to Sherwin-Williams or go to Behr, and they will have a historic collection or a heritage collection. And if you're selecting colors from that, or at least looking there, maybe going a hue different, you're going to get something that's generally appropriate, something that generally will be approved, and you'll be good to go. Ultimately, paint colors are sort of the least of my concern. It's something that can be fixed, unless it's brick or stonework, which if that is not painted, you should not paint it. It is not appropriate to paint unpainted stone or brick. The last part of this, if anyone wants this, I can include the slideshow in the packet. It's just sort of going through different historic districts and showing their boundaries. Because this was also originally this presentation, I wanted to show people certain areas that are in some of our districts, HD1s, you know, and HD2s. So some people don't know what their district is, and some people might not realize that, for instance, in South Park along Wayne Avenue, it's HD1, and that's mostly to help the business owners there sort of have more freedom and leeway to do a little bit more repairs and changes to their property as needed for their business. And yeah.
Holly, can you scroll back to McPherson for
Yeah.
Emmy? Thank you.
It's all HD2. And yeah, we have, like I said, 12 local districts. Anything 50 years old, we're getting to that point where things in the 60s, 70s, you know, they might qualify. And it would be more work for me, but I would love to see more districts.
I've got a quick question. Go to the Five Oaks one, or 3. We have 3. When you say 12, do you include the 3 Five Oaks, or you just refer to Five Oaks as one?
No, these would be 3 separate districts: Squirrel Forest, Grafton, Rockwood, Woe, and Kenilworth. They're all separate districts. So if you include all of them as one, I guess we would then have 10.
And also, when you did your inappropriate doors, on the unapproved, that one with the 3 dealies on it in the lower right-hand corner,
Yeah.
that would probably be on a lot of mid-century modern, which is coming up for historic now, right?
Yes. So a lot of our historic districts right now are similar timelines, you know, late 1800s or 1800s, early 1900s. When we get sort of these new landmarks and these new districts, we will have to sort of update and have mid-century options. It's not anything on the books right now, but when that came up, that would definitely be something we'd need to include.
Thanks. Time's flying.
Yeah.
I make just a quick comment, Holly. On the door design,
Yes.
the Landmarks Commission is looking for that design to be appropriate to the architecture of the structure as well.
Yes.
Not you can pick any one of those that are appropriate and use. And the same applies for windows. While we approved replacement windows, the number of lights in the window has to be representative of what was originally there.
Yes. You're really looking to maintain the style of the building. And it might seem kind of nitpicky, it might seem like a lot, but small changes add up, and we're doing what we can to preserve the integrity and make sure that it's continues to be a district where you can see what these buildings were like, how people lived back then. You can see the integrity of these structures and appreciate them for what they were
And a
and
quick
what they
one,
are.
another quick one. When you talked about the major versus minor changes, and I know that you didn't list all of them, but solar is major, right?
Yes, solar is considered major, just because a lot of times it's going on a roof and they want to make sure that the connections are right. They want to make sure it's not visible as possible. we have guidelines that we can, share if anyone.
Well, I went
ever-
through the system, but I just wanted to make it clear that and got approved, by the way. Thanks, Fred and the gang. But, and it's up here saving me lots of money. But I just wanted to, get that clarified because I'm not sure that everyone knows that.
Mhm.
So thank you.
I would just like to add one thing. I think, Holly's presentation was great, but I shared this story with Mike. We had a family move in from Beaver Creek. They were in a new suburban plat, and homeowners associations in the suburbs have very stringent things, requirements of what you can or can't do. Can you put up a birdhouse? They wanted to do sort of a natural grass section in their front yard, just part of it, about a third of it, and they were told they couldn't. So they sold their house in Beaver Creek and moved to the Oregon district. So I think when you compare our historic district zoning guidelines, they're not nearly as stringent as what maybe some of the suburban plats have to live up to. And I think the unfortunate thing is the stuff that makes the Dayton Daily News is, a dispute over a paint color or and then social media goes wild and it makes it look like we're living under some terrible set of onerous regulations, and we're not. And I think the numbers speak for themselves. The property values, by preserving those small important details, we're contributing to the property values of the city.
Holly, the question from Terry Sims. Do you have a map of the Lexington Avenue district? And then another question, are there any historical homes or businesses in the Residence Park neighborhood?
Oh, I might not have gotten to the end of my thing. There are, I do have in here all the maps. Old Dayton View. Hopefully soon we'll see Dayton View Triangle and College Hill on these lists.
The Dayton View, Lexington Avenue, 0 to 100 and 100 to 199. Those first two blocks off of Salem are within the Dayton View Historic District.
Yes.
The other side of Broadway is not.
Yes.
Can you explain again about solar panels and historic districts? Are they allowed, not allowed? What's historic about a solar panel? I mean,
They're allowed. I've got them on I'm historic, Stan. They're allowed. You just have to go through landmarks in the city.
Yeah, here in Oregon, it was not an issue at all, Stan. The solar company just presented the plans. Holly reviewed them. We went before a landmarks commission, and we actually got some good feedback from Fred and Laura Siebold about using black grids instead of aluminum ones, and that was no big deal.
Yeah. And if it had to stay completely, historic with energy, we'd have to go back to coal, and that would be horrible.
And our goal with solar panels, our goal and our guidelines are to try and keep those panels towards the back half or the rear of the structure so that it's not as visible from the street.
So Mike, and Holly, I wanted to jump in and maybe I'll throw Verletta and Charles in there too, is that I think one challenge that I would sort of put on all of us is that there's not right now any way for someone who purchases a home in a historic district to know that they're going to be held to these requirements, that they have to reach out to landmarks to get minor and major modifications. Now, I know a lot of the neighborhoods try to do that through their neighborhood associations and sharing that information when properties are sold or transferred. So I don't know if there's any solutions to that in the works, but I've seen that happen again and again. And I think that that's an area for improvement.
Yeah, that's a great point, Katie. I know we've had, at least in my neighborhood, we've had a few particularly of our new Americans, immigrant families that have come in and they have literally no idea. Plus, there's a language barrier. It's a very difficult thing to navigate. So, Holly, do you have any comments on that?
I know it has been an issue. We are certainly always trying to make sure our guidelines are more accessible. We're sort of working on digitizing them right now. And another thing that I remember Steve Gondel mentioned was reaching out to, and it just one of those things that got lost during the lockdown, I guess, reaching out to sort of realtor associations, making sure that the realtors know when they're selling a historic home that it's going to come with these sort of restrictions on it. Outside of that, I'm not really sure. It is an issue though.
I think there is a component to, oh, go ahead, Roletta.
I was just gonna tell Katie, thanks for throwing me under the bus and out on the street or whatever you just did.
That is not what I did, Berletta.
No, what I do want to say that gives us an opportunity, Holly, to work with the historic districts and making sure they have the information, at least the initial information to share with potential home buyers in the neighborhood. And they do an awesome job in connecting, and I see all y'all historians on here, connecting with the next buyer or someone that's interested and or the realtor. So I think the first initial part should be us giving, Holly giving each one of the neighborhood presidents that are historic districts, as well as, I think, Monica, you're the president now? A PDI, is that correct?
Yep. Yes, I
Thank
am.
you. And making sure that Monica has enough to share with all the others in different languages as well, right? Sharing the information on the initial part and then directing them to whatever digitized information we have. But the initial piece should be Holly giving you all the information, whatever information that is.
So the little brochure, the pamphlet that we use in our welcome packages is living with historic district guidelines. Is that right, Barb? I can't remember the exact title.
Yes, I think it's living in a historic district or something to that degree. Yes.
It's a handy dandy little pamphlet that has all the essential information, and it's relatively, I think we just make our own copies now, but Verletta, I think in the past you've provided them in bulk quantities, the city's printed them. So it's still very current, simple to follow. It's got the right links on it. So I would suggest that as.
Holly, do you have that pamphlet?
I don't think that I have, I have many things.
Monica, can you send that to Holly and Verletta?
I think it's up on the city website. It's online.
It is. In fact, I just mailed one out yesterday.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I know in our historic district and Dayton View Historic District, when we get a new neighbor, we try to deliver to them a copy of the guideline, what we call the blue book, and it shows all of the requirements. Unfortunately, I think a lot of new homeowners try their best to plead ignorance. They would do something and they don't want it or haven't come before landmarks or probably even on minors. They try to do the work on the weekends or when they think an inspector isn't around. It's just human nature, I guess, but we try to make sure everybody has a copy of the blue book that provides the guidelines.
Yeah, we do too in McPherson, but I really think connecting with the realtors would be great. I know that's not easy and it's not going to reach everybody, but getting those people before they purchase so that they know, not to deter anyone. Obviously, there's a ton of benefits, but someone purchasing something and having a plan and then realizing they're not going to be able to do any of that, it's be great to get people ahead of time.
No, you're right. And to speak to Verletta's other point, we do plan on, once we get everything sort of digitized, having our guidelines translated. And I think having brochures offered in different languages would be another great step, because sometimes there is that language barrier and we want to make sure people of all kinds know what they're getting into.
Question, just while we're talking about that, the blue book came up. Are there any thoughts about republishing that or updating that, just because of some of the more, what I would say, modern day amenities come to mind in terms of solar? And I mean, I scoured that book and I still had a lot of questions, but that's just one big example. Is there a thought about updating that in terms, especially when it comes to, I think, the list in the back about recommended resources and stuff? I know I just hopped on that Heritage Home program in Cleveland. Amazing resource. Had no idea it was out there. So that's the first thing I pick up when I have questions about my home.
Yeah, it is current. We are currently sort of working on the next iteration of the Blue Book, early stages, getting it all sort of easier to read, updating the information, because some of it is outdated now, and hopefully offering more resources, up-to-date current resources.
And I think too, with those maps, the question I had there, and then you had those slides, and I was like, oh, these are amazing. I think those maps might be helpful to include in there, just because I did not know that about parts of Grafton. And for my current job, actually, everybody was just under the assumption, oh, we're not going to acquire properties in historic district because of all the restrictions. Well, it seems like that may change the tone a little bit about where to get involved with, can we save these properties and take the risk?
Oh yeah, and I will say, I've been here 2 years now. I don't think that I've ever seen the Landmark Commission make any terribly unreasonable judgments. They're open to sort of working with people, and they understand sometimes there need to be alterations, and if they're done reasonably and respectfully and appropriately, a lot of times they will be open to requests.
Holly, I think those maps were really helpful. If you go to the Preservation Dayton website, thanks to Keegan Sickles, we do have an interactive map where you can use Google Maps and all the mapping tools that Keegan put together to see the boundaries. But yours are so much more static and clear. And if you sent those to us individually, we put them up on our website. But if you could actually get them on the city website, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah. There are a lot of things that I think need updating in our process and our website, and government can be slow, but we're working on it, I promise.
Yeah, but if you just send us your original PowerPoint, then we'll put the maps up. Keegan is our data web wizard.
That's awesome. Well, we're way past time, which is great, because this has been a great conversation. I appreciate all of you, especially Monica, Samiran, and Holly. Thank you for presenting today. I especially appreciated kind of the high level overview for even, someone that I've lived in Huffman for about almost 10 years now. I didn't know what the whole process was, back in the 80s when Huffman became a historic. I didn't know what process they went through. So it was really informative for me, and obviously for those that will be coming up on this possibility for our neighborhoods in the future. But I appreciate all three of you giving us a really high level overview, but also just the basic of, if I want to go paint my house, what does that look like, and kind of demystifying some of those. I know I've heard that many times from my neighbors and potential neighbors about how restrictive, landmarks can be. And I'm like, that's really not the case. But so this was really great. If you have, I did put Monica, Samiran's, and Holly's contact information in the chat. If you do have any follow-up questions, and by default, you can always reach out to Holly here in our department and ask her questions, and she can help out. She's also, I put it out there for those of you in the historic district, she also is happy to come out to your neighborhood meetings and talk with your neighbors. So definitely contact her to invite her to your meetings as you have them. So With that said, I'm going to stop recording. I appreciate you all. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you on June 7th is our next meeting date. Or no, wait. June 5th. I spoke too quickly. June 5th at 10 a.m. So you can put that on your calendar. I'll hold you in suspense of what our topic will be. Have a good day, y'all.